Welcome to Michigan Justice Chronicles with Dan Geherin.
Hello and welcome to Michigan Justice Chronicles with board-certified criminal trial attorney Dan Geherin. Thank you for being here. Today we're going to be discussing one of the most tragic and shocking murder cases which occurred a few years ago at the University of Idaho, where 4 college students were brutally stabbed in their off-campus house. Now, a PhD student at a nearby college is charged with their murders and is awaiting trial. Dan, as a former prosecutor, first of all, thanks for being here. Welcome.
Thanks, Kevin. I appreciate it. It's a juicy topic and one I'm anxious to talk about.
Yeah, me too. Obviously, it kind of jarred us all when we read about it. You know, you're a former prosecutor and board certified criminal trial attorney. I'm sure you have some perspective in this case. What can you tell us about it?
Yeah, perspective indeed. You know, other than just pure curiosity, I've just finished reading my second book on the subject. And, you know, aside from the sheer brutality, as you said, and the sadness and the number of victims and all of that makes us want to pay attention to a case like this, for those of us in the criminal justice system, myself included, there are a lot of very interesting aspects to this case and to this investigation. Interesting for a criminal justice attorney because I can take lessons from this. I can learn lessons from this. And there's some cutting edge things that went on in the investigation and certainly some unique aspects of the case, as I said a minute ago. You know, again, aside from the brutality, the sadness, the number of victims, the 3 most interesting things to me that come out as a criminal justice practitioner. One, as you said, Kevin, the nature of the defendant. He's a PhD student. He's in criminology, the very field that might end up putting him in the gas chamber or away for the rest of his life. No prior criminal history and no apparent motive for these 4 college students who were slain. So that's an interesting sort of unique aspect to the case. The second is the long delay. We're talking 3.5 years ago, believe it or not, that these brutal murders occurred, and we still don't have a trial. And it's not, as I understand it, till summer of this year. So there's been some significant procedural delays in the case, one of which was a change of venue, which I'd like to talk about, the uniqueness of that sort of procedure. And then thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, most intriguing to me, the way in which the police triangulated on this suspect, Brian Kohberger. They used what's called Ancestry DNA and cell phone location mapping to sort of get to their man. And very interesting, very sort of cutting edge technologies that are being used in police investigations. And I'm happy to talk about all aspects of that case.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we get into this in more detail, have you handled high profile murder cases before? And if so, how did you approach those?
Yeah, high profile for sure. But this, as you can imagine, Kevin, this Idaho case is in a stratosphere unto itself because I don't think we've seen a case that has such international and national interest, curiosity as this one. Maybe you talk about O.J. Simpson and some of the cases that I've done podcasts in the past on. This one has the nation's eyes on it, the world's eyes on it. So I've never had anything like that. And I would say probably thankfully, because when you do a high profile case, everything, of course, is magnified. People are different. Judges, jurors often have an agenda. Prosecutors try cases differently. And that microscope can be very blinding for those attorneys in that system. So the answer to your question is no, nothing in that stratosphere. But yes, I've handled many high-profile cases, both as a prosecutor and a defense attorney. We've had cases on Dateline. We've had murder cases, a lot of local interest cases, one of which I did a podcast previously of a lot of interest here in what was called the Egypt Covington murder trial. And each of those, as to answer your question, presents its own challenge because oftentimes you are wholly devoted to that case for 6 months, a year, 2 years, to the sometimes exclusion of your other cases and your other clients. But also, as I said, just the magnifying glass on those cases, the public interest, the ways in which the participants often change, that can be very difficult. But clearly, these types of cases are not for the inexperienced attorneys. They're not for the attorneys who dabble in criminal justice. They're for the attorneys like me that have made this a lifelong commitment as a prosecutor and as a private attorney.
Yeah, you bring up a good point when you brought up the O.J. Simpson trial, because I mean, obviously under such scrutiny and all that, but even on top of all that, like the players involved became punchlines and late night talk show monologues, and you know, I mean, it to be a part of something like that it's a different kind of game, and it's got to be tough. I don't blame you for saying that you're kind of glad you never had a high profile case to that level.
You're right. And just a quick comment on what you said. Judge Ito, all of the memes about Judge Ito at the time, he presented himself very unflatteringly to the public. And judges have a tendency to do that because they're under the glare too. They may not have the experience in these cases. So it can be tough on everyone involved, sort of a fishbowl mentality. In the Idaho case, as I said, times a million for those participants involved in that trial.
So how often are cases moved out of a jurisdiction like this was? Is that unusual?
It is unusual. I've not had one in my career, and I've been doing this for 27 years. I've not had a case either as a prosecutor or defense attorney moved out of a jurisdiction. Frankly, I don't even think as a defense attorney I filed such a motion. They are very difficult to win. You have to essentially prove that the local jury pool is either so saturated with case information or cannot be fair or is implicitly biased against the suspect or the defendant. Again, that's a high burden. It worked in the Idaho case, again, probably because of that magnitude of the case. But at the end of the day, is it going to make a difference? We're not in the 1800s anymore. One county is not so separated from another.
Yeah,
everyone has social media. Everyone knows the case. Everyone sort of has the same sensibilities. Now, that said, if you move from, say, a progressive liberal county to a very conservative rural county, then the jury pool changes, and that can make a significant difference. And that's my point about moving cases. Got to be careful what you wish for, because if you move it out of a favorable county and you find yourself in an unfavorable one, your client and you are going to be kicking yourselves.
What was the reason for this move?
Again, the judge decided that the magnitude of the case there with a small county, I don't remember the name of the county, it was Moscow, Idaho. They just didn't feel they could find any jurors who didn't have either preconceived notions on the case or that had some sort of prejudice against the defendant after reading some of the press coverage. And I think from the defense's perspective, they were looking for any delay reasons, and it's worked. We're, as I said before, 3.5 years down the road and still no verdict, still no trial.
Does the delay typically help a criminal defendant's chances, or is it typically hurt, or does it go one way or the other?
It's a great question. And the reality is it probably moves the needle a little bit in the favor of a defendant. I always tell my clients, it stinks when a case drags on for a while, the anxiety, the fear, the money, all those things. But generally speaking, the scale tips a little bit towards the defendant for a lot of reasons. Memories fade. Sometimes witnesses move. Police officers retire. Evidence is spoiled or lost. So those things can make a difference for a defendant. By the same token, I can't tell you, Kevin, how many times I've had a case that's dragged on, and sort of right on the heels of trial, some new evidence comes forward, whether it's new scientific evidence or the client speaks to someone in these jailhouse confessions or someone comes forward, and that can be a major blow to a client. So it is really a 50-50 type thing. But if I were to put a feather on the scale, I'd say it generally helps a defendant just a little bit.
Okay. So talking about that cell phone data that you referred to in the opening, what challenges can be made to the cell phone evidence? How accurate is it?
Just to back up a step, what they do now, all of us have our cell phones. Mine's in my pocket. Yours is probably in front of you. And if your phone is on and not in airplane mode, then it is bouncing signals off of your local tower. And if the police get your phone, they can see what tower is closest to you, and they can start to map precisely, I should say, where your phone is in a region. And then they can start to follow your phone if you travel with it. So it's a way of sort of following a defendant or a suspect to see where he or she has been. In this case, they followed Brian Kohberger's phone, and it was pinging off of towers right near the Moscow murder scene. Now, interestingly enough, he had allegedly turned his phone off or into airplane mode for several hours during the homicide. Why is that unique? They found that it was the first time he had turned off his phone in years, and as a sociology student, he would be well aware of cell phone data. So circumstantially, it looks like maybe he did that on purpose. To answer your question even more specifically, there are scientific challenges that can be made. It's called Daubert challenges to the reliability of this evidence. Unfortunately, as we sit here in 2025, most of those challenges are done. Judges across the country are almost universally accepting these cell location experts to come in, even non-experts. People that work for police departments are able to accumulate this data and testify about it. You can also make arguments that it gets a close tower, but it is not exact as to where someone was. So if there's some debate, someone say lives near a murder scene, you could argue that there's no evidence that he or she was at the scene. Outside of that, you are often stuck with the evidence of where your client's phone was and therefore where he or she was.
Just for context, because it has been a while for me as well, how did they land on this suspect?
So three ways. One, I just talked about phone data. They got a warrant, if I recall, and found that his phone was in the vicinity. Two, they had a grainy surveillance tape with a white Hyundai, sort of a unique older model. They did some license plate search and found that he owned a white Hyundai Elantra and lived 20 minutes from the murder scene. And then most importantly, this what we call ancestry or familial DNA. That is where they found DNA at the crime scene, in particular on a leather knife sheath, the knife that was used to kill these four. They found male DNA, ostensibly either skin cells, sweat, saliva on that knife sheath. They ran it through all of their CODIS, their nationwide database, to see if it hit anyone, and it didn't. So what do the police do? Like they've been doing the last several years, they go to DNA and Me and Ancestry.com and they run it on a public search. And lo and behold, they found someone related to the suspect. And then they go to that house, they start to pull trash, they start to get DNA and link it up to Mr. Kohberger. They arrest him, they get a warrant for his DNA, and what do you know? His DNA is a 100% match to the DNA found at the knife sheath at the scene. So sort of these 3 points, car, cell phone, and Ancestry DNA landed their guy. What they're able to do with that, we'll see in the trial.
100%. It's a high percent.
There's no doubt. And I experts sort of come in and talk about this 1 in 6 billion type things. They give numbers so astronomical. And what they're saying is, just as you said, there is no doubt, let alone reasonable doubt, that the DNA on the knife sheath at the murder scene belongs to your suspect. And then it's up to his attorneys to figure out either a challenge to that DNA evidence or some reasonable explanation for how their client's DNA ended up in the murder scene with the knife sheath.
So what challenges can be made to family DNA or DNA evidence in general?
As we speak, his attorneys are challenging, and it doesn't sound like it's going very well from the press coverage I've read, but I think they're challenging the legitimacy of it and whether they should have had a search warrant to get to his family's DNA and things like that. But that's really not going to cut it, because at the end of the day, a judge signed a warrant once Kohberger was arrested to get his DNA. So they'd have to challenge that. And really, as I said before, once your client's DNA is at the scene, then you're relegated to, was there some sort of contamination? Did law enforcement contaminate the scene? And short of that, then you're left with, well, here's my explanation for why my DNA is on that knife sheath. I sold it. It was stolen. I lent it to somebody. Then that would make sense why his DNA was on it, but it didn't explain why he would have been the murderer. Outside of those two, I can't think of much else, Kevin, that his defense team's going to be able to do with that.
Yeah, it seems like you said, if the judge issued the warrant after he was arrested, that the judge felt there was enough probable cause to allow for that to happen, correct? If I'm using that term right, probable
You have
cause.
used it 100% correct. And to get to that arrest, it sounds like the police were careful. They did this, the car, the cell phone, and then they got the link to a family member, pulled the trash, and they had enough ammunition to say, we can arrest this person. And once they're arrested, just as you said, that gives a judge probable cause to put his signature on a warrant to get his DNA.
Wow. So how do you think, in your professional opinion, I know it's just your opinion, but how do you see this playing out? What do you think this is gonna look like come summer?
You asked me that 20 years ago, I probably would have said, from what I've read, the evidence is not overwhelming against this suspect, and especially with a suspect who has a clean background and presents well and looks to be quote unquote normal, if there is such a thing. I would have said that he had a good chance for jurors to recognize some reasonable doubt. No motive to kill. No one can put him directly in the house, although there was an identification of a white male in the house. No real exact evidence other than the circumstantial 3 that I talked about, and maybe an explanation for the DNA. But in this day and age, with such magnifying glass on a case, we've seen it over and over. I think jurors are affected. Jurors know the impact of these cases. And if they, find someone not guilty, they have all of this uproar on social media and so forth. And I believe that's a real thing. So, I would say my prediction is he'll be convicted. I would say that the DNA evidence is probably his undoing. I don't think the cell phone in the car is as important, but like I said before, good luck explaining why your DNA is in a knife sheath where 4 people are brutally murdered with a knife and you live 30 minutes away. So bet a coffee on it that this one comes back guilty.
Yeah, I mean, you're right about it's circumstantial, and watching enough true crime and lawyer shows and movies to know some of these things. But when you put it all together, you've got the hard evidence of that DNA, And the car, yeah, on its own doesn't really mean much. The cell phone thing, that's interesting. The turning off the cell phone for the first time in years is very interesting. And it's all, again, circumstantial, but when it all comes together along with that DNA, it's going to be tough on the defense, I would think.
There's no doubt. And then, the strategy of whether Mr. Kohberger will testify, that's always a strategy for the defense. How does he present? What would he say? Does he have an explanation? Like I mentioned before, that could change the tides too, because if he gets on the stand, says, I didn't do this, this is why I think my DNA was there, and it's plausible, then the prosecution may be in some deep trouble, especially, as I said, if he presents well. And I will leave with this. Imagine that pressure on both sides, but imagine if the public defender is representing Kohberger, if he is innocent, if he truly is, the pressure on them to free an innocent man, that's overwhelmingly stressful, especially in this day and age with all that magnifying glass I've mentioned a few times, but it'll be interesting. I'll certainly have my eyes on it.
Yeah, no doubt. And real quick, you said it starts this summer, right?
Well, that's what they say, but who knows what other delays are coming.
How, I know that things happen, but do you think this is going to be one of those really super long trials?
Yeah, I would guess so. I would guess that the DNA evidence by itself is going to take a long time because they have to build that link I talked about. And then with all of the victims and the police that had to find them and they're eliminating other suspects and so forth, I would imagine this is a good long month trial. And that's just a guess on my experience.
Yeah. Wow. Well, it's going to be very interesting to watch this play out. There's no doubt about that. Well, thanks for tuning in to Michigan Justice Chronicles with board certified criminal trial attorney Dan Geherin. To connect with Dan, head to glgmichigan.com and please like and subscribe to our channel and leave us a review. Dan, it was really nice having you here. Thanks so much for shedding some light on such an interesting, horrible, and fascinating case like this one.
You summed it up correctly, and thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.